Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big Al Devlin video here at the House of Devlin, and this is the first video that I'm going to be doing in a very mini series about the origins of paganism, what is paganism, and basically the wisdom behind it all. Basically at the moment I am running a series which I call to myself Twitter Wars, but it's actually called Big Al versus the Idiots, where basically I go on to social media, but predominantly Twitter, but I do use other forms of social media to see what the common belief system towards pagans is, and what is the common sort of themes of belief and so on and so forth with regard to regards pagans and paganism. And there's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of misconception, there's a lot of ignorance out there, and so this video series I'm doing, this probably be about 2 or 3 videos, is me telling you the history of paganism up to current day. Okay, and of course the best place to start any story is obviously at the beginning. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking, which I've done briefly before, but I'm going into major detail here. I'll be giving you dates as such, or time periods, and of when certain things happened and how things evolved. I'll be giving you archaeological evidence, or referring to archaeological evidence that shows how really paganism developed and roughly at what period of time it developed, to show you the age of the religion, and the common core concepts between paganism when these sort of began to develop. So it's a nice history lesson for all pagans also, because of course this is something which we may not know, being a religion or faith that practices oration as its form of teaching. A lot of this may have been lost over the years within your clan, and this is my way of giving you back the knowledge that we once would have had on our sources and our beginnings, at least from, as I say, an archaeological perspective at the very least. And I'll then be talking about today then the evolution of sort of what I would call proto-paganism. It's still paganism, but it's the root paganism. It's the very first belief in pagan belief systems that exist, and then how that then derives then into modern Western European paganism. Now, one thing I will say is, when I say paganism, we need to first of all define what am I talking about when I say paganism, because paganism can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. When I say pagan or paganism, when I say pagan, I say I am referring to the person who practices the faith and religion of paganism. That I'm not referring to someone who is involved in politics, right-wing politics. I'm not referring to a Satanist. I'm not referring to someone who practices a non-Christian faith or Christianity, not as strictly as you. And I'm not referring to people who practice a pagan faith but outside of Western Europe. There are other forms of paganism that exist within the world and have existed in the world, such as the Egyptians' belief system, for example, with the pyramids and the Sphinx and stuff like that. That is a form of paganism. Rome, again, it comes in the Western Europe, so I won't mention that. But in Africa there was also various forms of paganism that are belief systems that exist, but I will not be referring to them, because what I will be referring to when I say pagan or paganism, I mean Western European paganism. And I really will actually, I won't even include the Romans in this, the Greeks and the Romans, for example, in this, because even though they practiced and are officially considered part of Western paganism, their paganism is very different from the rest of Western Europe, in the sense that they have different gods, different belief systems, different ceremonies, so on and so forth. So even Hellenistic paganism, which is the paganism which the Greeks and the Romans practiced, will not be considered when I say this. So whenever I say paganism, I am directly referring to Western paganism, Western Europe paganism, which today we would know as under a variety of names or denominations. Essentially, it's all the same thing. There's slightly different beliefs between each denomination, but ultimately they believe in the vast scape of things, the same stuff as each other. It's like saying Catholic and and Anglican, for example. They both believe in the same God. They both go to church. They both pray. They both do a lot of the same stuff. It's just some of the ceremonies change and differ. That's all. And there's maybe some slight difference in belief structure or whatever. But it's exactly the same within paganism. Yes, there are some differences, but the differences to us are insignificant. We don't actually care about the differences. We kind of like them, to be honest. We like a bit of variation in our religion because, as we say, it gives us a different perspective. You know, their perspective, our gods, is just as valued as our perspective of our gods, because we're both believing the same gods, but they see it from over there, we see it from over here, and overall we get a much clearer image of what our gods are like, how they think, and everything else, on our religion as a whole. So variation amongst the pagan faith is not seen as a bad thing, it's seen as a good thing, and it is embraced to some degree. But you obviously do hold on to your own individual beliefs, okay? And so, as I say, just to make things clear, when I say paganism, I mean the following: Western European paganism, which would include Celtic paganism, which is the predominant form of paganism out there. In fact, really, all the other sort of variations of paganism kind of almost root off from this. This is the second oldest form of paganism after proto-paganism, or what I would actually call Wicca, but we'll get into that later, because Wicca is a different thing today than what it was back then. Back then it was completely different. Okay, so we've got Celtic paganism, we have Nordic paganism, which is what I practice, we have Anglo-Saxon or Britannic paganism, we have Iberian paganism, and I forget the last paganism that is part of Western European paganism. It's either Baltic or Slavic, I forget the word, but Baltic or Slavic paganism. Sort of researched that before making this video, but anyway, they're the religions that I'm talking about that essentially form the overall pagan faith. As I say, there are other pagans in the world, and there have been other pagans in the world. Hindus, for example, officially are pagans, but I'm not talking about them when I say pagans. I'm talking about the ones that we all think of, the Vikings, the Celtic warriors, things like this. This is what I'm referring to. Okay, now regards the origin of the faiths, we have to really go back very, very far, and we have to go back very far because we want to see how our faith began and how it evolved into what it is now. Like all things, religion is fairly organic. You know, it can be man-made and very forced, but paganism is very organic. It's like nature. It evolves over time, and it evolves as a reaction to the surroundings around it and around the people who practice it. Okay, but ultimately the core beliefs have remained the same since the beginning. It's just there have been added beliefs added to it, or ceremonies added to it, so on and so forth, and so things have got more complicated as we go along. And at the beginning, the religion was just very simple, very basic, as you could imagine. When we talk about the time periods that we're going to be talking about, you know, we're looking at 300,000 years ago, for example. You can't really expect man to be as advanced as they are, for example, 2,000 years ago. And we see 2,000 years ago people being as primitive, so imagine 300,000 years ago. Okay, now what we need to first of all look at before we look at timelines, okay, is understand what is religious behavior, or what is indicative of religious behavior. Okay, religious behavior is indicated by the following things, certainly within ancient periods of time. Okay, cave paintings, okay, or drawings. Okay, when people paint upon the caves that they live in, their homes essentially, one, it's a sign that they are quite successful in their surroundings and so have time to do this kind of stuff, but it also will be just like art today. It will be just reflective of the surroundings they're within. But when there is paintings directly referring to things which obviously do not exist within the world that they exist, that is a direct sort of representation that obviously there is a belief system of religion. But even when it is representing what is around them, if there's a common theme between every single cave painting, and it's done in such a way that it is obviously not just decorative. I mean, these people would have been surrounded by many animals, for example, many different species of animals, but if they're painting just one species of animal again and again and again, and in its predominance, a predominant aspect of their drawings is one animal or two types of animals, they obviously see those animals as being higher up than any other animal, and in many respects this has now become animalism, which is a form of religion, okay, is where the worship of animals as a practice of faith. And we do see animals existing and the worship of animals to some degree within paganism today. It's nowhere near like how it would have been back in ancient times, and we'll describe what it was like in ancient times, but we still have, for example, this is just one small example within, certainly I know within Nordic paganism, and I believe it's in the same as other forms of paganism, but it plays a major role within Nordic paganism, is the field I've just been on Google to listen to how this is pronounced. I'm on YouTube and got a Danish person to say it. Fylgja, okay, the Fylgja. Now the Fylgja are essentially animal spirits that are born or created as part of your afterbirth, ultimately. The Fylgja are essentially like a guardian angel, is the best way of put it in modern terms, that accompanies yourself as an individual and is directly related to yourself. Your personality represents itself within the Fylgja, the Fylgja, okay, within the Fylgja, okay, and so, for example, if you're a potent combatant, for example, you fight in the army, you're a boxer and all the rest of it, you're very much a man's man and a warrior, and essentially just of modern times, then your Fylgja may be, for example, a bear or a wolf, or some kind of ferocious predator or carnivore of some kind, but it could be or an eagle, or it could be any animal. And the animal does represent you as a person, and it's there to protect you. And there's multiple uses with Fylgjas that most pagans won't actually even be aware of them. I have not visited my Fylgja yet. I will do it in time, but the only way to do it is to use pagan magic, okay, and trances, and there are certain specific things that you have to do to be able to visit them, understand what they are, and you then, once you become accustomed to Fylgja, and there is another evolution of this as well. There's a branch of Fylgja which are essentially associated not to you but to your ancestors and your family and your clan, and this represents your spirit of your family as a whole. It would probably be a different animal to what is representing you, and this animal spirit can also help protect you, for example, within the spiritual realms, or guide you, but it is directly representative of your ancestors, okay, and your family, your clan, your kin, all that as a whole, okay. And so you can see that animals, and this is just one small example, animals are still worshipped to some degree within paganism, but they become sidelined into the spiritual aspect more than anything else, okay. You can also do it for example in transformation, for example when people, shapeshifting essentially is what I mean. And when the berserkers in theory, whether it be myth or true, can transform into the bear. They don't probably physically transform into the bear, but they transform into the spirit of the bear, that the spirit of the bear possess them. And again, we see animals being used here, and the worship or the sort of at least respect of the animal is there within a certain specific aspect of paganism. So the animals are definitely part of paganism, and as I said, they're within the spiritual realm particularly, or within the spiritual aspects that interact with the material realm, okay. So animalism is the most basic form of religion that we all know of as modern men, and that's just a simple fact. And paganism does have roots within there. We still have aspects of that original animalism within our own faith and religion, but as I say, over time our religion and faith has grown and developed to become much more expansive, a lot more complicated. Other religious signs of religion, a religious practice, is not just paintings and what they represent. As I said, they may be depictions of people or gods or animals and stuff like this, but the most obvious is, and actually the oldest form of religious practice known to us that we can recognize, are graves and burial of the dead. And there is some very old graves and burial sites out there that go back, as I say, let me see, the oldest ones that I know of, I think it's 300,000 years ago, if not 500,000 years ago. I think 300,000 years ago is the first sort of unconfirmed one. But 500,000 years ago was the first unconfirmed one, but 300,000 years ago is the first confirmed burial site. Okay, where not only is the person buried, but the person is buried with material goods, such as maybe tools or a weapon, or protection or religious symbols, for example, carvings such as this. And this is obviously a religious practice, because these tools, these things that the people are leaving with their bodies of the dead after burying them underground, putting all their effort and energy into putting the dead underneath them into the ground, is a sign of not only the effort put into burial, but the fact that they are leaving them with valuable assets is a sign of religious practice, for obvious reasons. Because if you did not believe in an afterlife, why would you give your tools to someone who's dead and can't use them anymore? You're going to take the tools because they're useful to you. They're going to help you stay alive. And so graves and burial sites are obviously obvious major indication of religious belief, because animals don't bury the dead, okay, and humans didn't bury their dead at the beginning. We only started burying our dead, as I say, really confirmed in the last sort of 300,000 years. So it's only been in the last 300,000 years that people have actually believed in an afterlife or spiritual life, that we know of at least so far. We may find another burial site that's 800,000 years old, for example, but at the moment, as far as back as we know, 300,000 is the oldest that it gets. 500,000 unconfirmed. Now, there's something to speak about that actually also, which is interesting, because it's not just humans who bury their dead, but we'll get onto that later, and it's not animals. We'll get into that later. It's interesting. Okay, other signs of ceremony would of course include, not just the cave drawings and artwork, for example, but figurines, carvings, religious symbols created as a form of artwork that can be carried around or placed within a certain part of your household, which would be a cave back then, because this was it was the Ice Age, but men lived within caves at this point. And so these are the things that we need to look at. And these are the things that archaeologists look at to work out whether there is religious practice within the areas where they look. Now, as I say, the very first sort of burials and signs of religious worship, such as in the form of animalism, that exist within Western Europe. Bear in mind, this is in what's called the Middle Paleolithic period. That means that it's in the middle of the Ice Age, essentially. So we're talking Europe as well, especially, was very, very much encased in snow, ice. It's a very cold, very dangerous place to live. Most humans still live within Africa at this point, but there were a few who lived within Europe and expanded into Europe and other areas of the world. But there was one species of human, okay, that were, we are Homo sapiens, but there were also Neanderthals, and they flourished within Western Europe at this point in time. They were not affected by the cold in the same way that Homo sapiens were, and there's massive proof that they not only buried their dead. In fact, actually, the very first burial sites were Neanderthals. They were the first confirmed type of human to bury their dead, but they also had bear cults. They actually worshipped the bear, and bear cults was something that they definitely had within their be it primitive or not, their belief system. Now, we do see bear cults also forming within Homo sapiens around that same period of time, and burial of the dead. Now, whether we are copying them or we're just sort of coming to terms with the same sort of things that they also had, or maybe they were copying us, I don't know. But we also had bear cults form around the period that the Neanderthals began to form bear cults. And as I said before, bear cults exist within paganism, and were very much a big part of paganism to some extent. Well, not a big part, but they were very well respected parts of paganism in the form of the berserkers. The berserkers were essentially a bear cult, okay, because they worshipped, or didn't worship, but they personified the bear in their fighting techniques, and whenever they went into their trances before battle, for example, and they often wore the skin of bears that they had killed with either their bare hands or with primitive weapons like knives. They could have killed them with a spear and a shield, but where's the fun in that? Kill them, let's fight as fair as possible. Okay, but anyway, as I say, the bear cults, the berserkers, which were major part within Nordic paganism. Nordic paganism used the berserkers a lot, but berserkers could come from any form of paganism. If you had gone through what I've gone through, and a few other people here on YouTube have gone through a death and rebirth experience where you die but then come back, you refuse to stay dead basically, despite not receiving medical practice, medical people help bringing you back. You just literally come back by yourself. Then basically this obviously would have happened a lot back then. If you fell, for example, into the waters, died, but then suddenly resuscitated yourself and managed to swim out the waters, or you were bitten by an animal, you bled out, and then you came back. There's a lot of different ways in which people can die, right? And the people who refused to stay dead, they became what we call now the Hammers of the Gods. And back then there were war bands and groups of individuals that would take these people like myself, and you would become part of these cults. And one of them, as I say, was the bear cult called the berserkers, and any pagan could be part of any warband or cult essentially that existed at the time. The other one that I know of are the warrior shamans, which were a Nordic element, which was just essentially berserkers again, but you could be the academic version of it. Essentially, you were still a warrior, but you decided to remain amongst your people and use your sort of higher learning centers to teach your people secrets that you've learnt about your religion. And the only one I know of is the Druids. Okay, and the Druids were the same. That's just the same term, different word, but the same meaning as warrior shaman. Okay, so Nords called them warrior shamans, Celts called them Druids. And this is where, if you hear Druids, you think, oh yeah, I've heard of them. Yeah, they exist today. No, they don't. Well, they do. I'm a Druid in theory, or a warrior shaman. Okay, we do exist, but we are not a separate branch of paganism. I'm a Nordic pagan. I'm not a Druid. I am a Druid, but I'm a Nordic pagan. And within Nordic paganism, I would be called a warrior shaman. But if I went and met a Celtic pagan, they would call me a Druid, for example. The words that they use doesn't matter. I'm still the same thing. And as I say, we have a universal term amongst ourselves that is called the Hammer of the Gods, because we all have different names for different things. But so we're trying to use a universal term where we can all understand what we're talking about. Right. And as I say, that means as a result, as you'll see in perhaps my third video on this little mini series that I'll be doing, sort of modern neo-paganism. So not modern paganism in the way that I practice ancient paganism, but in a modern way. But neo-paganism, paganism that has been created by commercial systems in modern times. But we'll go through that, and Druidism will be covered in that, because Druidism was created not very long ago indeed, and is not a genuine branch of paganism. It's its own new form of religion. It's not. It's nothing to do with paganism. Okay, it's based off paganism, but it's not actually a form of paganism as we would see it. Okay, now let's get back to the history and the facts. Trying to get in certain things as we go along, such as the fact that Druidism doesn't exist. Druids do exist, but not in the form of Druidism, as I say, as an actual formed practice of religion. So we see around about 300 years ago to 50,000 years ago, there have been predominantly burials and animalism as the only sources of religion, really, around that sort of period of time. Okay, some 50,000 to 300,000 years ago, our religion was as basic as it came. It was the worship of animals, and so it's in the formation of bear cults, and it was the burial of our dead, because obviously we believe that our dead must have gone to somewhere else beyond the material realm. However, around 50,000 years ago, we then start finding caves with cave paintings of increased complexity. We do find, and over those, and beyond 50,000 years, so from 50,000 years ago to 14,000 years ago, we see the cave paintings becoming more and more complex and more abstract in their presentation. And as they become more abstract, you obviously understand they are painting gods. They're not painting just what they're seeing around them. The religion and the belief that they obviously have is flourishing, and it is becoming far more complicated, and as they gain an understanding of their faith and their belief system. Okay, the kind of caves that I'm talking about are all predominantly found in France, actually, what we know as France today, but obviously would have been called Gaul in Roman times, and God knows what during the upper Paleolithic period, which is what we're in now. So, which we're in now. And when we discuss in 14,000 to 50,000 years ago, that's the upper Paleolithic period. Okay. And the cave locations that we see are Lascaux, which was is a cave complex that is 17,000 years old. Okay, we find a cave complex, and in Lascaux, by the way, there are over 600 areas of wall paintings. So it's quite an expansive complex of cave paintings and drawings. So we're not talking just one cave here; we're talking 600 caves. Okay, and Dordogne, this is roughly 50,000 years old, and Chauvet, okay, which is aged between 32,000 and 37,000 years ago. Okay, now if we start with the oldest, Dordogne, okay, the caves in Dordogne depict, again, as I said, just animals, really, in their cave paintings. Okay, and the animals that they typically drew, there was a variety, but there was a very, very common theme amongst every cave that you go across, and all the paintings typically were themed around these particular animals. On the small percentage, like 5% of the drawings, and that's the figure given here, were of stags and horses. Okay, so obviously stags and horses were worshipped to some degree, or at least recognised or seen as beautiful creatures and worthy thus of adorning as an art form, the caves. We don't know if obviously there is a religious aspect behind horses and stags, but when you have 95% of the drawings being that of bulls, specifically the auroch breed of bull, okay, or cow. And bears, you obviously are seeing the bear cults, but also the bull cults existing within a religious aspect. There's some kind of belief and worship of these animals to some degree, and it's interesting because within paganism, of course, yes, we know we've already discussed the bear cults and the berserkers, and bears are involved in other ways within paganism. For example, for me, on a personal level, for example, I've got a bear tattooed on my forearm here, and the bear to me represents myself. It represents warriors, and it represents berserkers, obviously, and it represents the men who will fight in a Ragnarok at the end of time against the fire giants. So the bear, even on me as a modern man, was something that I got before I knew all this, but whilst I had only just a basic knowledge of paganism, because the bear just seems to call to you for some reason as a pagan. But the bull, and I've got a massive tattoo of a bull on my right shoulder that I can't show to you. We also see this within paganism, also within actually the cosmos, which is the creation story. It's essentially equivalent to Genesis in the Bible. We see it in the pagan cosmos creation story, and bull, the bull, or the hermaphrodite bull that we see, because it's both male and female. The bull that we see, and it's done in that way, not because they believed that bulls were hermaphrodite. They believed that it was really to show and depict in an abstract way the force of creation behind the bull. Obviously, the bull was seen as the ultimate. You got to remember, these people at this point in time are hunter-gatherers, so they relied on gathering fruits, nuts, and stuff like that from the surroundings. But their prize was meat, and the bull, the auroch, that existed at that time, which dwarfs the common modern-day bull, despite all its sort of selective breeding that's happened over millennia to make them as big and as meaty as possible, were dwarfed by these wild cattle called the auroch. They were much similar to bison, and they even were bigger than them. And obviously, being able to kill one of these would be very difficult. You would probably lose men in hunting one of these down, because they were aggressive, big, strong. Bulls today, if you ever see a bullfight, they're dangerous as anything, right? But bulls back then were a whole different ball game, okay? And so, obviously they would have been worshipped because their meat would have sustained the family for God knows how long. It would have been a feast worthy, literally, of the gods themselves. And so we actually see this, as I say, this bull that called Orthumbla within the cosmos story of pagan cosmology, representing really a force of creation, and that's why it's hermaphrodite, because it's a force of creation. It can create life without the need of another, essentially. That's why it's represented as hermaphrodite. And what it does is it finds things that can live. It finds the gods, but they are in this kind of almost stasis. They're unaware. They're alive, but they're not living, if you understand what I mean. But it gives to them its milk, and in doing so, it gives what we call the breath of ecstasy, or the madness of the gods. There's different terms for it, but the breath of ecstasy is a term that I was taught. And the breath of ecstasy that Orthumbla, the bull, gives to these things that it unearths out of the ice at the time, which is obviously a direct reference to the ice age that these people lived within originally, releases the gods from the ice and gives them self-awareness. That breath of ecstasy makes them aware, makes them aware of their surroundings themselves. They have a consciousness, they have a mind and a personality. As I say, the fact that they were all buried within ice, and the cow releases them from the ice by digging them out and then giving them the breath of ecstasy, as I say, is very symbolic of the origins of paganism, definitely being rooted within Ice Age period, or as I say, the Paleolithic period. And the bull being part of it shows, obviously, again, its origins, with the worship of the bull, the worship of the bears and stuff like this. It shows modern day paganism as being rooted within the animalism that existed originally. Okay, and this was, as I say, typically what you'd find in the caves of Dorgonia. However, if we then look at the caves in Chauveau, which are dated between 32,000 and 37,000 years ago, we not only see animals painted on the walls, but we also see or find other examples of religious practice, and then this is figurines. Okay, we find the figurines that have been created, and they're simply called the Venus figurines. Now, don't let that make you think it's the goddess Venus, if it's not. It's just the name that's been given to them. These figurines did vary, but typically they were mostly female. They were big-breasted. They typically didn't have hands or feet, but they were obviously female, often lacking a face. It was really mostly just the body of women. However, there has also been found figurines of men also, and also figurines of androgynous humans. So the gender really doesn't really matter here. This is where I really see paganism as itself, the real core paganism, starting to be created now, because of course, you know, in Nordic paganism we have, for example, Ask and Embla being carved from wood, and so because they're both carved from trees, they are equal. They're equal. They're carved from the same stuff, but they were carved from different types of trees. So even though they're equal, they're still different. And these figurines really represent this, trying to represent this concept of equality but difference. And with this androgynous figure in the middle, this androgynous figurine that figurines that they also found, really represents that the kind of merging between the two genders in many respects, and the equality that must exist between them, but also representing the differences. It also represents, as scholars have, let me read to you exactly what the scholars say, represents the shamanistic spiritual transformation process. Okay, now to me this also represents the origin of, as I say, what I would see, maybe not as the very first form of paganism, because that would have been, of course, the animalism within the middle Paleolithic period, which would have been anywhere between 50 to 300,000 years ago. But we're seeing now, around the period of 32 to 37,000 years ago, the formation of what could absolutely be 100% recognized as Wicca, the mother and the hunter, a female and the male. And these are the only representations we have of gods at this point. Okay, they're just not even drawing humans on the caves. It's just animals, and then these figurines, and sometimes depictions of these figurines painted on the walls, but obviously not in the form of man and woman, as I say, in these sort of abstract depictions of both man and woman. And so here we now have the origin of what I believe to be the ancient practice of Wicca, not the current practice of Wicca, because that's a commercial modern concept, but the original practice of Wicca, which for as much as any pagan I've spoken to knows, has died out. And has died out because of persecution, especially within the Middle Ages. And I'll be doing a video on the persecution of paganism and how that's affected our knowledge, and how it's affected the way that paganism is practiced today, and how it's allowed then to, as you'll see in the, as I say, the third video, commercial paganism to be created. Okay, basing itself off concepts that originally existed, apart from Druidism. Forget about that, it's not based on anything. But Wicca, modern day Wicca, I have no problems with it, but I would love to see that Wicca brought back to its more primitive roots and practiced like a true Wiccan would have practiced. Can you imagine 32,000 37,000, the best part of 40,000 years ago, Wiccans having altars and candles of different colours for different techniques, and casting spells, you know, for specific, you know, creating love potions and shit like this, right? No, you can't. They're concerned with survival at this point in time, and they're giving praise to the mother and the hunter for that survival. The mother who nurtures the women when they are at childbirth, for example, the woman who is the sole creator of life, and thus almost essentially a representation of the ability of the gods to create. But on Earth, women are divine in essence. They can create life, but they can't do so obviously without males also, because of course it requires a male and a female to come together, but it's the woman who bears the life and brings the life into the world. Hence why we see a predominance of these female figurines. And of course childbirth back then would have been very dangerous. Okay, a lot of women would have died during childbirth, so it's obviously this fertility figure would have been seen as something as a sort of practice of protection, because what we do find is in a lot of the cave drawings and a lot of the depictions of these figurines and that is that their religion at this point is based on a apotropic nature, or apotropaic, sorry, apotropaic. I'm not learning a lot of words in the research that I did for this. An apotropaic nature, and that is they are wardings and protections typically. So these people didn't feel safe, 100% safe in the world around them. They weren't the masters of their environment as we are today, and we're still not masters of our environment. All that needs to happen is a tornado to suddenly appear outside my my window down there, and I'm a goner, you know. As much as we can master the environment, we're still at its mercy. But regardless, we are a lot more masterful of our environments today than we were obviously back then. And these people obviously did feel fear, and so obviously having the female figurine there that has been referenced as Gaia many a time actually, whether that's the academic or whether there was proof of that within findings, I don't know, but it has been referenced as Gaia because it was represented as an earth goddess. The way sometimes it's depicted, it's a female, but a kind of earthly female, if you understand what I mean by that. Then, of course, we get to the youngest of the caves, the Lascaux caves, which are 17,000 years old and much larger complex. These are the ones where there's been 600 wall paintings discovered. Here we find painted the animals like we did before. We find the Venus symbols, so we see these fertility and figurines being produced and found, and we also find painted onto the walls humans doing things, whether it be hunting or whether it be actually religious ceremonies. So religious ceremonies are actually painted onto the walls, along with modern day sort of everyday activities such as hunting and stuff like this. But it's at this point that we definitely get obviously a organized religious practice coming in. So it's 17,000 years old is really when you do have a very formalized religious structure to paganism as it is at this point in time. Still probably not fully recognizable to a modern day pagan. We would see the grand concepts, of course, of our religion represented within their religion, but we're not going to see it as complicated as it is today. But we would see a lot of the grand concepts being included within the religion at this point in time. As I say, for the Wiccans out there, pretty much this is how your religion should be and be practiced as, because this is Wicca 101 right here, right now. Okay, but then what we do is that we see a progression. I'm just making sure I've covered everything. Oh, the eldest of the figurines, by the way, regards the figurines that have been found, the predominant amount of the figurines that are being found, whether they be male, female, androgynous, come from around 21 to 26,000 years ago. So we see that's probably the age of Wicca for example, around about 26,000 years ago, but the eldest actually come from 35,000 years ago. So we can see the beginning of Wicca 35,000 years ago, or what we now call Wicca, but may have come under a different name back then, and the sort of origin of all paganism. Nordic paganism would still be related to this to some degree, because in some of the caves, one of the things I wanted to mention, the female, which comes back to the ones in Lascaux, which was 17,000 years ago, we see the female goddess, or the female figurine, being depicted as a goddess of the sun. Surrounded by golden aura and stuff like this, because they had different colours obviously that they could use. A lot of yellow was depicted around the female figurine, and it was obviously being worshipped as a sun goddess. Now there is actually direct links from that into other caves that are related to it later on in time, or in other settlements nearby, where this is actually a representation of the goddess Freya. Now, Freya is not the goddess of the sun, that's Sol, okay? But she's not the goddess of the sun. But what she is the goddess of is gold, amber, honey, all these things that have a golden hue to it. She is still the goddess of these things. But as the religion became more complicated, she became obviously, and still remained, obviously a goddess of fertility. This figurine that's being represented is not only the goddess of sun, but the goddess of fertility. She's still a goddess of fertility, Freya, but she also became a goddess of war, goddess of beauty, goddess of magic, so on and so forth. And so we see actually not just Nordic paganism, but Celtic paganism and Iberian paganism found within these female figurines representing the goddess Freya. And there was, I don't know where the reference is. I dug and dug, but I've seen the paintings, and it's obvious to me which goddess it represents. Yeah, the ones in Lascaux do show the female, obviously representing the goddess Freya. Okay, so we start to see the existence of the Vanir gods, the gods of Vanhenheim, essentially, being represented. Here. Maybe the male figurines are in fact Odin, who knows, okay, or Tyr, depending if you're a Celt, of course. But yes, the figurines, the oldest are about 35,000 years ago, but typically 21 to 26,000 years old is the average age, and as I say, it's around 17,000 years ago that you start to see them then starting to evolve and depict what we can definitely recognise as modern pagan gods. And so really, I think the very birth of the very beginning of Nordic and Celtic paganism and Iberian paganism exists around the 17,000 year period. So that's how old a religion is, 17,000 years old, but with origins up to 300,000 years ago, certainly 50,000 years ago at the very least. Okay, but what I wanted to say is you do get a major transformation, okay, a huge transformation in the religion and its complexity around 11,000 years ago. 11,000 years ago, we ceased to be hunter-gatherers. Obviously, a number of humans would have remained hunter-gatherers, but we see a predominant movement towards what we call now into the Upper Paleolithic period. The Ice Age has ended. We move into the Neolithic period, which is just post the Ice Age, and we see, because of the retreating of the ice and the snow, we see us go from hunter-gatherers into agriculture and settlements. We actually begin to start living outside of cave complexes. We create our own settlements, and we base around those settlements agricultural farming practices. I can't read my writing. Oh, and yes, and in addition to not only the formation of agriculture, i.e. the growing of crops, whatever it might be back then, but we also see the domestication of animals. And so we've gone from the Uruk being this bull that's being worshipped and represented directly, not only through Urdhumbla in the cosmology story, but also within the runes, through the rune of Aruz, which is the rune of strength. We also see now that the domestication of animals, and this being represented now with the rune of Fehu. So we can see the transformation process being represented in our rune system, for example, the Elder Fuvok script, for example. And so we know that all this is true, and that our ancestors who practiced paganism experienced it because they are representing it in their religious tools, in the stones, in the runes and stuff like this. We can and in the stories, such as the Cosmos story, and that we can see how things are changing and how that's been incorporated into the religion. Proof that this is not just me going, oh yes, this archaeological find, and this is obviously paganism. No, there is proof. There's proof within the practice of paganism and how that reflects what has happened existed in the past. And there are, as I say, there's the runes, there's the Filgia, or whatever they're called, the Cosmos story, everything. Okay, there's a lot of different, and of course the reference to Freya as the golden goddess. Okay, 17,000 years ago. But as we move into the agricultural and settlement phase, if we move into the Neolithic period, this is when we see a boom 11,000 years ago in our religion, because no longer are we suffering to the same degree as we once were. We can't freeze to death quite as easily now that the Ice Age is over. It's still cold, but compared to what we were used to, piece of piss, right? No longer are we able to look for a food, we can grow it. So people are not dying from starvation, people are not dying because they're freezing to death. They are, but to a much lesser degree than they were before. And as a result, they have a lot more time on their hands. As a result, they have a lot more things to be grateful for, and as a result, they have a lot more to pray for, such as the successful harvest of a crop, for example. And this is when we see the introduction of paganism in its truest recognizable sense that we have today. And it's around about 11,000 years ago that the religion really developed and became, as I say, paganism as we know it now, as Nordic paganism, Iberian paganism, Celtic paganism, Britannic paganism, and, as I say, Slavic, Baltic. I'm not sure which, I can't remember which one. I think it's Slavic paganism. Okay, and so these all existed and started to exist around 11,000 years ago, and came into the complete fruition where we would completely 100% recognize everything. The stories, the Eddas, everything came into, well, the Eddas didn't come in at this point, but the stories like Thor and Odin and Ice Giants and Ragnarok, the stories were all there and had fully developed to the point where they are now 5,000 years ago. So they still developed, 11,000 years ago was the beginning of the creation of these stories and the recognition and the fruition of all the gods that we now recognize. But it was 5,000 years, 5 to 6,000 years ago, where we see the full development of the religion to a recognizable level to which it is at this moment. Now that predates Christianity, which is obviously 2,000 years old. It's around the same age, although 11,000 years ago obviously is a lot longer than Judaism, but 5,000 years ago, when our religion was fully developed, is around the time when Judaism came about. It's around the time that actually, and of course Islam came about 1,500 years ago, so it massively predates that. And so, regards to all the Abrahamic religions that exist out there, with the Abrahamic God as their their sole focus, we have nothing to do with you. Okay, and so this video, I hope, by proving the origins of paganism, dismisses any doubts whatsoever that you may have had regards paganism and Satanism. Satanism is a religion that comes from Christianity, some kind of Satanism that you believe in, at least anyway. It comes from yourself, hence the name Satanism. Satan is a Christian term, okay, and it represents Lucifer, who obviously rebelled against God because of his jealousy of man and the fact that he had free will. Now, that is, on to the surface of what essentially Satanism is. What the hell, pun intended, does that have to do with paganism? Absolutely fuck all. Paganism existed a long time before your religion did. Okay, that's Western European paganism. You may find other forms of paganism being even far older than that. Who knows? But Western European paganism, which is the ones who you keep pointing the finger at, think again. We have nothing to do with your religion. We never have, and we never will. You have taken our holidays and made them yours. You are the ones borrowing traditions that we developed. And these religions, as I say, are fine. I've got nothing wrong with Christians, nothing wrong at all. Because, of course, my mother's one, for starters. But not just that. I grown up in a Christian country, and I believe the Christian faith to be a good one. But I can't tolerate prejudice and discrimination towards paganism from Christians who believe that we are part of a sort of almost not a creation of their faith, but a sort of anti-version of their faith. We've got nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with you whatsoever. If you are afraid of us, that's your decision, but we're not asking you to be afraid. Okay? Thank you, and I hope you've learnt a bit there. Our second video is going to be the golden age, the first golden age of paganism, because I believe we're entering a second golden age very soon. But the first golden age of paganism, i.e. when paganism was the sole religion of Europe, pretty much, just prior to Christianity, obviously, being expanded across the world via the Roman Empire. Okay, so thank you guys, and I'll see you soon. That will take a lot of time to research. There's a lot to talk about there. As you can see, I've spent about an hour on just the origins, and the research for this took a little while, but it's going to take a lot longer to do research on the golden age of paganism, to give it justice, that is. Okay, thank you anyway. I'll see you soon. Goodbye.